Two major companies here in South Africa have given us some food for thought on succession planning in the past week. Pick n Pay letting go of its non-performing CEO only to replace him with a retiree who left the retailer some 16 years ago. First Rand, this is the bank, on the other hand, mounting a complete overhaul of its top leadership structure, placing Mary Vilakazi in the CEO role. Well, Vilakazi was the company's chief operations officer, but her appointment to the top post came as no surprise in the organization, as some were reportedly suggesting that she was groomed for this particular role. So let's discuss now what these two scenarios teach us about succession planning in companies. And we're joined by the Chief Operating Officer at BDO Wealth Advisors, Ricardo Teixeira, and he joins us now. Ricardo, good morning to you, and thank you for your time. Let's begin with succession planning. What is it, and why is it important for companies to have in place?
Correct, yeah. So I think the starting point for succession planning is about acknowledging the fact that it's a transfer of leadership of a business, of an organization. And at the heart of that, I think, really lies the challenge of succession planning, because to transfer leadership talks to the ability of actually knowing what does the business stand for, what is the strategy of the business, and being able to have the ability of people, or capable people, to take that lead and take the helm and lead the business in continuity, so that the business continues without any sort of break in operations, any break in performance.
Yeah. So the good thing about this conversation, Ricardo, is that we have two examples that are going to give us the sum total of what we are going to learn out of this conversation. Pick n Pay, as we've explained in the introduction, they've let go of their CEO because I suppose things are just not panning out as what perhaps shareholders would have wanted to. And so they've brought back someone who was in the role of CEO some 16 years ago, Sean Summers, back in the fold now. What does this tell us about whether or not Pick n Pay had a succession plan in place?
So Corey, I think to be very frank, I think it shows and highlights the fact that there's really been good, I think, decisive strategic leadership at the Pick n Pay board. Remember, succession plan is not necessarily saying that there's going to be the grooming or the ability for someone to take over. Ideally, yes, that's the game plan, and we can talk more about that. But if you just reflect on what's transpired and played out at Pick n Pay, I think it stands to reason that the board actually took a very decisive stance because of the poor performance of the CEO. Bearing in mind that when we talk around succession, it's succeeding the lead executive, which is generally the CEO. And if the CEO himself or herself is not performing, it really needs the board and those governance structures behind the executive and behind the firm to actually take a decisive step. So I think in this case, what the Pick n Pay case does showcase is that actually the ability for the board to actually step forward and actually make a change, as hard as it may be, knowing that there was no successor planned and replacing the CEO. I think the other point it also talks to the fact that it is incumbent on the CEO to build depth within their leadership structures for succession.
Yeah.
And in this instance here, when the CEO is at fault, when the CEO has failed, I think it stands to reason that actually not only the performance of the business, but possibly in the ability to build succession, which even, I think, highlights the comment that you make now, and I think we're reading in the media around how the board replaced Peter Buren with Sean Summers, knowing that actually he wasn't fit for the job.
Yeah. And then we have the First Rand Bank example, Mary Vilakazi. She comes onto the role of COO, and the assumption, at least the talk, is that she had been the understudy, and this was the person that the bank had earmarked to ultimately go into the position of CEO. How should we read that situation?
And it's a lovely contradiction or contrast to the Pick n Pay example, in the sense that here you have a board who's given advance notice of the CEO's departure in a year from now, and possibly just short of a year from now. And so it's really indicative, Xoli, that there's been advanced planning. There's been very well structured this transfer and succession between the executives. And I think it points to the fact that it was planned. And if it was planned, it actually highlights the fact that for the board themselves, for the governance structures within the first-rank group, that they have taken, I think, a very proactive approach in grooming for the succession. So I think here's a great example of how the CEO, Mr. Adam Pullinger, has played a very key lead in the succession plan for the first-rank group and been able to execute it with advance notice to the market.
Ricardo, is it difficult, in your view, to replicate at least the example of First Rand Bank into state-owned entities? Because that's where really we have a major crisis in the country. You well know the amount of resignations we have seen in the past week, and the latest coming just yesterday of the board chairperson. But we're talking the executive management structure here. Is it difficult to replicate this, or is it because of politics, really?
So if we break it down to the essence of succession planning, as I said earlier, it hinges on a couple of elements. It hinges on having a clear strategy for the organization. It hinges on the ability for there to be people, so to be depth, but it also hinges on the governance structures within that organization. And so if we just focus in on state-owned enterprises, Xoli, is that you can have clear strategy, you can have people available, both internal or external, but I think the failure is around the governance structures of these state-owned entities. Without a governance structure, what do we mean by governance structure? It's essentially the structure for leadership and decision-making in the organization. That starts with the board of directors, and it permeates all the way down into the entire sort of operational and structure of the organization. And so if the governance is poor, you're going to fail the succession. And I think that's what we've seen play out in the state-owned entities, is that there is a political interference. And unfortunately, you don't have clear lines. It's not delineated between here's the corporate governance structure and here's the political regulatory environment, let's call it that. And those two agendas are clashing. So you have a situation where there's not clarity in terms of how this entity is governed, and then as a result, you're going to battle with succession.
And I suppose to wrap up this conversation, it's interesting that you've touched on political interference. Here this morning, a scenario has occurred where Mpho Makwana is announced as leaving, but the Minister of Public Enterprises says in the media statement that the person who will be taking over is Mteto Nyati. This is not, at least how it was written at first, was that he would be an interim board chairperson until a permanent replacement is brought on. But later, a statement comes back to say, no, Mteto Nyati is going to be the incoming board chairperson. You will be familiar with the process that need to be followed here. Is that, in fact, the way that things are done, where a board chairperson is announced as leaving and immediately you have an incoming chairperson announced as obviously going to be taking over, and that's why Mr. Makwana is going to be doing a handover process up until the end of October? Is that really the way that things are done?
It's difficult to, I think, to I suppose, encapsulate that with saying that it's right or wrong, purely because of the fact that dealing with a state-owned enterprise. And in a state-owned entity, you do have these blurred lines between the corporate structure, the governance structure, so what are the terms of reference, what's the memorandum of incorporation of the entity, versus the actual oversight of Parliament. And it's that relationship that I think is at play here. And we see it across all the state-owned entities. Is it right? I think what is right, though, is having clear, decisive leadership. And so if it means that the Minister of Parliament needs to step in and override and take a decision, then so be it. But it needs to be then supported by the border structures and implemented. And so state-owned enterprises and entities are in a very peculiar position because of that, the dual sort of governing structure.
Yeah.
Is it right? I think the right answer is you need leadership. And so ultimately the question is, who's the lead?
Yeah.
Who makes the final call? Yeah. And if that's the case, if it means it's going to be at Minister of Parliament level, then so be it. Then it needs to be implemented and followed through.
Final question to you, sir. The impact of leaderless institutions, and I am specifically placing the attention on state-owned entities, because that is, some of these really do affect how the South African economy performs. Do we as media practitioners, you think, are we placing too much emphasis on leaderless institutions, forgetting that the interim people or the actors are there to actually do the work of these leaders that are going to ultimately be appointed? Or are we correct to make the noise that these institutions may have acting CEOs, acting board chairpersons, but in actual fact, they are leaderless?
It's a great question to challenge. And my reflection as a BDO, we've been advising businesses, whether it's listed or privately owned businesses, for a number of years, for the last 60 years in South Africa. And in that time, when we deal with succession planning, and to your question now, is when there is a void at the CEO level. Remember, the CEO is the executive leader who reports to the board, who reports to the chair. But if there's a void at the CEO level, the reality is that the strategic direction of the company comes to a standstill and it idles. The company will operate. So yes, we'll produce electricity, we'll ship freight on rail, but the strategic drive to grow the business and put it in the position where it's meant to be, where it's aspiring to be, where it wants to be, is a miss. And without that leadership, a business does fail eventually, and it does not perform the way it should.
Chief Operating Officer at BDO Wealth Advisors is Ricardo Teixeira. Let me thank you very much for your time and indeed your insights here.